That's what players like Meyers had to contend with, hearing chants like dirty redskin, dumb Indian, go back to the reservation. This was constant, and they had to cope with it and go about their business on the baseball field, not pay attention to it for the most part. It was tough. So just like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby and the first African Americans to baseball in the 40s, same sort of thing.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, sports fans, how you doing? Thank you so much for coming back to our little podcast in our little corner of the podcast world. We call it Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for coming back. If it's a return visit, if it's your first time here, I thank you for giving us a try. Hopefully we don't disappoint. And if you like what you hear, please indeed just give us a rating and a review with some positivity, if you would, wherever you can do such things, certainly Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening. We certainly enjoy and appreciate the love if you like what you hear. If you don't, well, don't tell anybody, okay? Thanks. All right, well, let us see. What are we working on today? We're talking about baseball again in our conversations in this hour or so, and in particular, a very interesting and richly complex story. It is centered around a player that played during the era known as the dead ball era of baseball, and that was sort of in the 19-teens and 1920s, and arguably the time, the era when strategy really became a very integral part and appreciated part of what we know now today as modern day baseball. Today, I guess you would call that small ball, right? This is an era where not only the ball was not nearly as lively as it is today in terms of its fabric and bindings and all those kinds of things, but also, frankly, the fact that the ball and the equipment was used on a very heavy basis. Meaning, for example, a ball would go in the stands. It was expected that the fans would throw the ball back and they would continue to play with it, scuffs and seam bursts and all. So the idea of not only the ball physically, but frankly, the idea of power hitting and those kinds of things and home runs, I mean, they were very, very uncommon at that period of time. And so the era of small ball, or we now know today as small ball, or certainly the dead ball era, and strategy is the background for our conversation today with our friend Bill Young. And the topic is a guy who, as a Native American player, another sort of part of this context and story, named John Tortes, nicknamed Chief Meyers, who was a standout catcher and hitter for one of the most prominent teams during that dead ball era, and that be the New York Baseball Giants. John McGraw is your manager, and nicknamed Chief Meyers was the battery mate of legendary Hall of Famer of that era, Christy Matthewson. As we get into this conversation, you're going to hear a multi-layered story about why the biography and the background and the history of John Tortes Chief Meyers was important. And again, one of which is just an understanding of the dead ball era. So this is a great story in that context. It is also a very interesting story in the context of the fact that Meyers, right, was one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, Indian or Native American baseball players of that era, and frankly, ever. And if you remember our episode number 14 with Bill Young, where we talked about J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues, we got very deep into some of the problems, challenges, hurdles, and issues relating to being African-American in playing baseball, the integration of such and the challenges, some of which frankly still exist today, unfortunately. But in many respects, this story about Meyers as a Native American baseball player, if you will, breaking through, it was almost a precursor to some of those African-American trials, if you will, in the same thing around being prejudiced against a minority, a misunderstood minority at that, the challenges of having to integrate and to stand out and to push back against being slighted and worse, and using one's prominence and fame on occasion to as a platform to push back and perhaps educate and enlighten people in that process. So this is a very interesting story on a number of different fronts, and hopefully you will find it as interesting as I did. And we will get to that conversation about John Tortes, quote unquote, Chief Meyers, and we'll get to the idea of why that nickname was either good or bad, depending on your perspective, with our guest, Bill Young, our return visitor, in just a couple of seconds. So stay tuned for that. Before we get there, of course, though, I need to remind you that we are sponsored under the good graces of our friends at Audible. And you may be tired of hearing this, but I'm telling you, if you haven't given it a try, the Audible audiobook service, you really are doing yourself a disservice. We love our friends at Audible, and a number of you have loved it as well, enough to give it a try, and we encourage you to do so. It's basically no risk. And if you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, you can enjoy a 30-day free trial of the Audible service, as well as, most importantly, your own choice of one of over 180,000 titles of your own audiobook to listen to and enjoy for that month period of time. There's just a ridiculous amount of titles and books that are available for you to choose from. And, I think giving it a try and being able to cancel at any time, including after that month, it's a no-risk way of enjoying and trying out what Audible can offer for you as an audiobook listener. So give it a try. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial of Audible service and a free audiobook download for you to enjoy for that period of time. We thank you, Audible, and we thank you for giving it a try in audience land. Thanks a lot. All right, so let's get to our chat with Bill Young and the conversation around the very interesting story and life and times of John Tortes Meyers, Chief Meyers, of the old New York Giants and the dead ball era of baseball, coming up right at you.
Well, I spent most of my growing up years in Oklahoma, a town called Ponca City, Oklahoma, which has its name because of the Ponca Indian tribe that had its reservation, its agency there. So I got to know some Ponca kids when I was growing up, high school friends, and two things really struck me early on. That number one was the pride they had in their heritage. And secondly, the discrimination and prejudice that they faced constantly. So I went on to teach at the college level, and one of my interests in teaching was Native American cultures, Native American history, particularly Native American religions. My field is religious studies. And so I taught a course on Native American religions. I wrote a book called Quest for Harmony, which is about Native American spiritual traditions. I've had a long-standing Native American cultures, history, religion. And I took students up to South Dakota, to some of the Lakota Sioux reservations. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I've always loved baseball. I grew up listening to Cardinals baseball and I'm a number one Cardinals fan, but secondly probably was the Giants. Back to when I was growing up, Willie Mays was the star. So loved the Giants, loved the Cardinals, loved baseball. So my son and wife and I were in Cooperstown in 2008, and we were in the Hall of Plaques and came across Albert Bender, also called Chief. He was a Native American from Minnesota, and my son, Matt, said, why don't you book on Albert Bender, Chief Bender? So looked into it, found that there'd been several good books that had just recently in 2008 come out on Chief Bender, Albert Bender. So decided so began to look around what other Native American stars, they're really good, excellent star quality players from the early years of baseball, what we call the dead ball era between 1900 and 1920, had not been adequately presented to the public. So it didn't take long to find John Tortes, Tortes, Meyers, Meyers, John Tortes Meyers, who played on with John McGraw, one of the best and famous managers of all time. He was the catch. John Meyers, and he preferred to be called John Meyers, like most Native Americans, all most all were labeled chief, but they didn't like it. It was not a. It was its origin, its background is really pejorative. But he was a catcher. He caught Christy Matthewson for years. Stayed with the Giants. Well, I'm sure we'll get into this, but so that's where I came from. So I said, I'm gonna see what I can do with Meyers. So I was able to contact his relatives. He didn't have any children that we know of, but he had grandnephew and a couple grandnieces that I contacted. And right off the bat, they told me about the fact that he had pride in his Native American heritage and grew up for some of his early years on the Santa Rosa Reservation in Southern California. Meyers is a member of the Cahuilla Nation, Cahuilla, pronounced Cahuilla, member of one of the 10 bands of the Cahuilla Nation. So reached out to them. They gave me some great stories. Found that Cooperstown, the library at Cooperstown National Baseball Hall of Fame, had a great file, and they're really wonderful in terms of helping people who are doing research. They copied all of Meyers' file, which was not insignificant, and sent it to me. As we'll talk about, he spent a year at Dartmouth College. Meyers did. Got into the Dartmouth College archives. They were very helpful. One of the bands of the Cahuilla Tribe Nation has a museum and a cultural center. They got me material, and finally, I'm a member of SABRA, Society of American Baseball Research. They have great files. If you're a member, even if you're not, but if you're a member, you can really get access to the material they have. So there was a lot of good material. So and
we got to remind our audience, so episode 13, where we talk about J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs and Negro League Baseball and stuff. It's a very dangerous thing to let Bill Young into anything related to an archive or a library or a museum, because there's no doubt that he will go deep and try to create a story or a book about it. And I don't think this is any different. And I love research, so writing can be painful. Research is fun. Yeah, I think that's true, and we sort of hear some of that in our little journeys here. But so what about Meyers stuck out, as a figure worthy of focused investigation? Is it the fact that he's of Native American heritage? Is it the fact that he was such a crucial part of a team, the New York Giants at the time during the dead ball era, which was so successful and standout? What was it? Was it a composite of all those things? What stood out in your mind?
The latter, really a composite of all those things. So start on the baseball side, as we began to suggest. He was a star for the New York Giants. He was a power hitter. He had a 291 lifetime average, which puts him, I think, seventh among the. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but among Hall of Fame catchers, he has an average only exceeded by 7 Hall of Fame catchers. So power hitting catcher. One of the first to be really called accurately a field general, where the catcher really is kind of the field general on the field. Very, very, very smart in terms of reading batters, helping pitchers. There was Christy Matthewson, and then the other probably standout Giant pitcher at the time was Rube Marquardt, who's also in the Hall of Fame. Marquardt had a lot of kind of anxieties, and Meyers really worked with him to help him become a truly excellent pitcher. Till Marquardt got to the point that he won 19 in a row, and Meyers was his catcher. Outstanding baseball player. Big guy, 6 feet, about 200 pounds, really big for the time, but he could still steal bases. And this was, the era in which that was considered. Not anymore today, but stealing bases, moving runners along. That was all part of what was called inside baseball, the scientific game, which McGraw is famous for championing. So number one, a great baseball player who deserves recognition. simply for his contributions to baseball.
Well, before we get there, I also want to put that in context, right? Because and we'll get into how he became a member of the New York Giants and the prominence of the Giants at that time. But maybe you can, in addition to going further about why Meyers, a little bit of sort of the dead ball era of the teens, I guess, the 1910s, et cetera, and the dynamic of
basically the first 2 decades of the 20th century is the dead ball era. It's called dead ball because the ball was literally not as live as it eventually became, and the reason was that they didn't take balls out of play. The ball went into the stands, it got thrown back in. Balls got scuffed up, they got dirty. Spitball was still a legal pitch until 1920, so the balls got all stained and marked up, and they just didn't go as far. The home runs were a rare. Somebody who hit 5, 6, 7 home runs a season was considered doing well. So you had to move runners along. You had to, kind of the one big name of the dead ball era is Wee Willie Keeler of the Orioles, who famously said, "Hit them where they ain't." Poke the ball between positions. I guess they didn't have the shift back then, but so move runners along. As I said, bunt runners along. That's the dead ball era, where you're and McGraw, as the New York Giants manager, is orchestrating this. He's the impresario in the third base coaching box. He's calling every move, and some players didn't like him at all, hated him, in fact. One of Meyers' teammates was the famous Jim Thorpe from another Native American, and Thorpe hated McGraw, but Meyers really felt that he thrived on his very involved, very hands-on managing style. So the baseball player, the other big thing I'd say is looking at Meyers' Native American heritage. This is the time, early 1900s, when there's increasing pressure to assimilate Native Americans into the dominant white society. Try to get them to turn away from their traditional culture, religions, values, give up their traditional land, take allotments of land rather than have collective land ownership. And Native Americans in baseball were held up as an example of the melting pot myth, that didn't matter what background you came from, didn't matter Italian, German, Irish, or Native American. If you could play baseball, you were in. Of course, this was what, 50 years before blacks were allowed to play. And Native Americans playing baseball were subjected to really intense prejudice, discrimination, beginning with the moniker chief, which is basically equivalent to calling a Native American boy, calling an African American boy. It's not. It became a more benign term, I guess you could argue, but at least in origin, it's really quite racist. So that's why there's so much opposition to, like the Kansas City Chief or the Washington Redskins. These are still painful for a lot of Native Americans. So against that background, Meyers stood out as someone who other Native American ball players tended to turn away from their heritage. Bender, for example, never really went back to Minnesota. He didn't make much of his Native American heritage. Meyers, on the other hand, drew extensively on his Cahuilla heritage for the values that he lived by. He went back after his baseball career was over and became a leader among the people. So he stands out as someone who stood up against the prejudice, had a lot of pride and strength that he drew from his Native American background. Other Native American ball players, the first was Francis Alexis, played for Cleveland. He didn't last very long because of the prejudice he experienced, and he gave in to alcohol abuse that plagued Jim Thorpe. Albert Bender was affected. Meyers never was. He stood proud, and that needs very definitely to be recognized.
And see, that's interesting because it almost, obviously the trials and travails of the African American player, not only in baseball but in sports in general, of course, and the assimilation and the prejudice and all those things, very pronounced and a huge spotlight in the decades, around all of that, right? But in many respects, you're actually suggesting, or perhaps isolating a case of this even prior to that, right? Which was of a previous generation of similarly slighted minorities, in this case, Native Americans.
Yeah, very definitely. Yeah, there were really two pronounced stereotypes that Native Americans had to contend with, not only in baseball but other sports. One was that it was what sometimes is called the savage warrior stereotype, that since Native Americans came from savage societies, they would carry that savage mentality onto the ball field. So how were they greeted when they came onto the field? With war whoops and the tomahawk chop that still is part of Atlanta Braves tradition. That was to call forth that kind of these are the savage warriors. But the other stereotype was that of the so-called good Indian, the smiling Indian, the happy Indian, who was always up, always positive, and the Chief Wahoo image. Think of Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indians symbol to this day, with the big shining grin. That harkens back to what's called the good Indian or the happy Indian stereotype. So that's what players like Meyers had to contend with. Hearing chants like "Dirty Redskin," "Dumb Indian," "Go back to the reservation." This was constant, and they had to cope with it and go about their business on the baseball field, not pay attention to it for the most part. It was tough. So just like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby and the first African Americans in baseball in the 40s, same sort of thing. All the time that the promotion, the official narrative is that, this is demonstrating the American that America is a melting pot. Baseball is a leading example. So some historical revisionism, I guess.
So okay, so let's go back a bit to Meyers's childhood. How did he get involved in baseball altogether, and then perhaps his journey into
baseball was introduced to Native Americans pretty early as one of the tools of assimilation. We'll get the young Indian boys to embrace the white man's game. So on the Santa Rosa reservation for Meyers, when he was there, he was playing ball when he was a little kid on the reservation, and then he found out he was good. He started playing semi-pro baseball when he was still a teenager. Early on, he played against the famous Walter Johnson, a big train of one of the best pitchers, and had encounters with him over the years. So among other things, Meyers was interacting with the greats of baseball of that era, from Grover Cleveland Alexander to Christy Matthewson to Walter Johnson to on and on. So in 1905, he's 25 years old. He was born in 1880. He got a big break. He was at a baseball tournament in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there was a team in the tournament that had a player from Dartmouth College. And Dartmouth College, in its origin, had a commitment to educate Native Americans. They'd kind of gotten away from it by early 20th century, really never had embraced it very, very fully. But this player from Dartmouth says, I think we have Native American scholarship. So he convinces Meyers to go back all the way from Albuquerque to New Hampshire to Dartmouth, and Meyers ends up spending a year at Dartmouth. Never plays baseball because they find out that he had played semi-pro ball, had a professional background. They try to recruit him for the football team because he's big and it's there that he gets the label Big Chief, probably for the first time. So he's not able to play at Dartmouth. One of his big regrets throughout his whole life is that he leaves Dartmouth after a year. His mother's ill. He gets an opportunity to play professional ball and make some money in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania first. And then his career takes off. He ends up playing in St. Paul in the American Association, and John McGraw spots him, is willing to pay $6,000 for his contract, which is about $150,000 today. So by 1908, he's in the major leagues.
So what was it that that John McGraw, obviously a very key figure, not only about the Giants and baseball at that time, but also in his discovery? How does he discover Meyers, and or maybe is there any sort of story as to sort of what? Yeah, well, hit his radar.
He and Branch Rickey probably are the two great, and Connie Mack are the great baseball talent whisperers, or what do you want to call it? They spot baseball talent. And McGraw, although he's pretty much has all the prejudices of the era himself, reaches out to people who don't have the opportunity, farm boys, and in Meyers' case, Native American. McGraw is famous for even trying to sneak an African American when he was with the Baltimore Orioles onto the Baltimore Orioles team. So he wanted the best players on the field. He would have signed blacks if he was able to do it. So he signs him in 1908, brings him up, and what McGraw typically did with young players is sit him on the bench next to him and watch. So he was signed in the summer of 1908 through the fall of 1908. He sits on the bench with McGraw and watches, and he sees in September 1908 one of the most famous games in baseball history, the famous Merkle game, in which Fred Merkle, the rookie first baseman, committed a blunder that cost the Giants, ultimately probably cost them the pennant, losing to the Cubs, who we know in 1908 won the World Series for the last time until 2016. So lots of interesting tidbits along the way.
Yeah, we're referring to, I think it's also known as Merkel's boner, which
Merkel's boner. That's what it was called.
There you go.
And the phrase, Merkel became a verb that meant to arrive late, because he didn't touch second base. Instead of, he hit a single. The rules say you have to. I guess he was on first base, and the rule is you have to reach the next base, or the play's dead. And he didn't get to second base. He took off for the clubhouse instead, which was common practice at the time. But Johnny Evers of the Cubs, smart ball player that he is, called the umpire's attention to it. So yeah, the famous Merkel play. But here's McGraw. Merkel comes in tears to McGraw and says, he's a young guy. I messed it up. Get rid of me for the good of the team. And McGraw said, heck no, you're just the kind of player I want. I'm going to give you a raise. And he stays and has a really great career.
But Meyers, right, essentially on the bench that year, right? He didn't get any real playing time in 1908. He didn't get any
playing time in fall of 1908. So he becomes the catcher in 1909. Roger Bresnahan is the Giants catcher in 1908. And McGraw, who like Branch Rickey always was ready to let players go when he thought they had reached their peak. And he also was a friend of Bresnahan, and the opportunity came up for Bresnahan to manage the St. Louis Cardinals and be player manager. So McGraw trades Bresnahan to the Cardinals, recognizing he's got this talented young catcher in Meyers, and that's indeed what happens. He becomes full-time catcher in 1909. That continues through 1915. In just to get a sense of how great he was, in 1912 he has a 3.57.8 average, which was the highest for a major league catcher until Mike Piazza, and then Joe Mauer had averages above that. But he's a really good ball player.
Why was he traded?
Why was Meyers traded or Bresnahan?
Bresnahan, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bresnahan. Well, there's a famous story that Bresnahan is talking to McGraw, and they're talking about the team, and Bresnahan says, "Look, maybe he wants to be traded, but he says, look, John, or he wouldn't have called him John. Look, Mr. McGraw, here's a player every bit as good as me. He's a better hitter. He's gonna be just as good a fielder. So you got the catcher of the future, and so that's why McGraw let Bresnahan go."
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download, but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. So in steps Meyers for the next season, and pretty much effortlessly, it seems, in terms of his ability not only in the field but also behind the plate in terms of hitting.
Very definitely. From the outside, he's hitting his average in 1909 is 277, 280, and 10, and then he has three really great years where he bats 352, 332, 358, 312, and so he's among the pinnacle of power hitters. He's recognized some groups who have tried to figure out who are the best players of that era as the best catcher of the dead ball era. He had a 9-year career. It's 10 years to qualify for the Hall of Fame. So there's a group who thinks that the Veterans Committee, which was not constrained by that, should give him a look as for the Hall of Fame. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe he doesn't quite have the stats, but certainly one of the best of the era.
Well, let's also put this in context, right? Because John McGraw, again, was not only a standout player and obviously a member of the National Baseball Hall of Fame, but had a very long and extended, mostly unimpeded managerial career prior to the Giants, but mostly with the Giants from 1902 to 1932, almost uninterrupted. A couple interruptions on
second most wins of any manager next to Connie Mack.
Right, so that's almost an uninterrupted 30 or so years of managerial success, including 3 World Series championships, including 1905, right, where so they're a constant team in the mix.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Giants of that era is one of the all-time best teams, yeah.
So having quality players and seeing something like Meyers, I mean, in some respects, right, Meyers clearly not only stood out in McGraw's mind, but to be able to be part of a team that was constantly in the mix for success and titles and all that kind of stuff. Maybe you can kind of explain a little bit about how Meyers and Matthewson, Christy Matthewson, I was a very famous pitcher of the time, how they hooked up, right? Because that's a battery that was very successful for quite a bit of time.
Indeed. That's an interesting question that I try to explore in the book is Meyers' relationship with, on the one hand, McGraw, and his relationship with Matthewson on the other. Speaking directly to Matthewson, they did become close. The only time that Matthewson ball players of the era, particularly if they were stars, were given the opportunity to go on to vaudeville. And so when Matthewson got the opportunity in 1910 to do a vaudeville show, kind of reluctantly, didn't really think he was up for it, and he only did it that one year. But he had Meyers come with him and benefit financially from being on in this Broadway skit in which Meyers plays the savage Indian, stereotypically. But I think maybe the couple primary reasons that they became close was Matthewson recognized this is a great catcher. I can have real success with him. The chief and I are good. Secondly, they were both college educated. Matthewson was a very bright guy, went to Bucknell University. Meyers only spent a year at Dartmouth, but in that year he became a lover of philosophy, art, literature. Through the rest of his career, when his teammates were going, to bars and taverns, he was going to art museums. So a real connoisseur of art, literature, liked to read philosophy. So intellectually, Meyers and Matthewson clicked. And thirdly, I think Matthewson was kind of a loner on the Giants. The other players kind of saw him as someone who kind of stayed to himself. Meyers similarly was rather taciturn and kind of a loner. They kind of gravitated toward each other. And Matthewson came from a very strong religious background and with values of being concerned about other people. So he undoubtedly recognized and saw the prejudices that Meyers was facing and befriended him in part because of that. McGraw, I think, Meyers' father, who was a Civil War, his father was white, his mother was full-blood Cahuilla. His father died young, or died when Meyers was young, and to some extent, McGraw was the kind of a father figure for Meyers. But they did get along well, and Meyers was able to overlook McGraw's. He had a terrible temper, and a book I'd certainly recommend to any baseball fan if they haven't encountered it yet it's called The Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter, and published in 1966, and it's just the stories of most of the players are from the dead ball era, and it's just their stories. He went around the country interviewing these guys before they died, and one of them is Meyers, so you get the full picture of Meyers' take on Matthewson, on McGraw. Lawrence Ritter, the Glory of Their Times, and it's part of it's out in CDs, so you can actually hear Meyers' voice in some of the interviews. So there's McGraw and Matthewson with Meyers. So he was part of one of the storied teams of all times, the Giants in those early years.
So the story around Meyers is that as a player, he was. I think you're kind of alluding to this. He's kind of a student of the game, right? In terms of his ability to predict pitches and locations and stuff. And maybe Mathewson saw benefit in that. Well, I was going to say, it seems like Mathewson recognized, perhaps because of this connection between the two of them, right? That he's got some intelligence around how to frame the ball and positioning of pitches and calling and that kind of stuff, right?
You got it. That should be said. They were both students of the game when that phrase was that wasn't a phrase used a lot. Matthew, and they brought out the best in one another. Meyers brought out the best in Matthewson. Matthewson brought out the best in Meyers. No question.
I think it's also interesting.
Meyers actually published a series of articles in the New York American where Damon Runyon was a writer, and he one of the articles is on kind of the science of hitting, another one's on the science of catching. So, yeah, he could have been a manager. He should have been a manager. Never had the opportunity. Well, he had a minor league opportunity to be a manager. It didn't last very long.
That's interesting. So it's almost like a Joe Madden type, if you will, almost.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, right. Yeah,
generation before. Well, he was also a very strong hitter, right? So in 1912, in particular, if I have this correct, Meyers was third in the MVP balloting.
Third in the MVP. Back in the time when it was called the Chalmers Award, you got there was a car called the Chalmers whatever, and you got a vehicle. So he was third behind his teammate Larry Doyle. And if you look at Meyers' stats, I think they're, in fairness, they're better than Doyle's. I'm not sure why Doyle got the award.
All right, let's get back to so clearly on the field as a battery mate of one of the leagues and a Hall of Fame pitcher, as well as behind the plate in terms of his,
the Hall of Fame, yeah.
Right. So let's get back. Let's talk about the. It's clear that he made some good copy, right, for the newspaper writers, right? So.
Oh yeah.
So how did he kind of ingratiate himself? It doesn't seem to me like he would be the type to sort of go out looking for press coverage, but how did that sort of persona? Because it seems like that was certainly part of his mix, being part of this team too.
Yeah, that's good to get into that. I mentioned that he really drew upon his Native American heritage, and part of that is the use of humor to kind of deal with situations of discrimination and prejudice. So Meyers certainly had a wry humor. One of my favorite stories is that late in his career, his hand was all gnarled from catching, and so a reporter asked him. He had begun signing with his left hand because his right hand was gnarled, signing autographs with his left hand, and so a reporter asked him why were are Native Americans left-handed? And Meyers says, yes, it goes back to the time when we were signing treaties with a white man, and we had to hold a tomahawk in our right hand because we couldn't trust the people we were signing treaties with, and so we had to sign with our left hand. So that's why all Native Americans are left-handed. Wry humor, I guess. Interesting. So he was full of stories like that. Late in his life, when he's in his 80s, he's kind of gained new recognition because of his being included in Lawrence Ritter's book, Glory of Their Times. So I begin the book with an incident that happened in 1966 when Casey Stengel was managing the Mets. And Casey Stengel goes back with Meyers to 1916 when both were playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, or the Brooklyn Robins, as they were called then, because of their manager, Wilbert Robertson. And Meyers comes to see the Mets play in New York, and I won't get into it because it's a little. I won't get into the actual story, but he pulls a couple really funny incidents when he's at Met Stadium. Interesting. Uses humor, but also draws upon. There's one of the basic values of his culture, the Cahuilla culture, is that there's a power. There's a power that you can draw on to make the best of the worst situations, and Meyers certainly did that. As I said, when he left baseball, he went back to California. He was from the Riverside area, went back to the reservation, became a leader, and ironically, he would tell reporters when they asked him, "Was he a chief? You're called chief. Were you a chief of your tribe?" And he said, "No, I was never." Every once in a while, he would say, "Yes, I was a chief," but only when he was trying to be funny. But he became a police chief for the mission agency, the group of tribes in Southern California. So late in life, he was well into his near retirement. He became a legitimate chief.
So when his presence sort of became kind of common in the press in New York, obviously, not only was he sort of overwhelming folks.
He appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. He appeared on the Today Show.
You're kidding.
So he was a media personality there for a little bit, thanks to the glory of their times.
Very interesting. So that was almost a rediscovery, I guess, of his story.
He loved to recite Casey at the Bat, which he did for kids on the Santa Rosa Reservation. His grandnieces and grandnephew remember him. He had a booming kind of very deep, very polished voice. Reporters often said he sounds like a college professor. His vocabulary and tone sounds like he's a college professor. But he would recite Casey at the Bat. He did that on the Today Show, for example. I'd love to. I tried to. I couldn't run down I guess I didn't have videotape back then, but of that. But that's on the CD that's available. You can hear Meyers reciting Casey at the Bat. Well,
it's clear he also got a bit of a taste of performing, and we alluded to it before, but maybe we can get a little bit more into this, right? So this idea that vaudeville, right, back in the teens, right, was obviously the preeminent form of entertainment back
Popular
in the day.
Entertainment, sure,
right, and so if I'm not mistaken, with the initial sketch that he and Matthewson were part of was called Curves.
Curves,
this
right.
Occurred in October of 1910.
Right, correct.
Performed in Hammerstein's Victoria Theater, which I guess is in New York.
They took it on the road. They went to a variety of places.
So so I'm trying to get into the mindset here of not only the time and the era, but also of Meyers, right? So you kind of, I think it could be described or construed as almost a minstrel-like performance,
well, as I
right?
said, the Curves was a little vignette in which, you can kind of picture this in vaudeville, where there's a maiden in distress and being threatened by the wild Indian, who's Meyers, and Matthewson comes and chases him away with a baseball bat. That's basically it. So I guess I have some trouble picturing Meyers being willing to do that.
Why do you think he did?
I think two reasons. One, he trusted Christy Matthewson, that Christy would not, the Christian gentleman, as Matthewson would call, would expose him to anything that he shouldn't do. And secondly, money. I mean, you'd get a full year's salary almost for doing a month of vaudeville. So it was lucrative. But they did it the one season. Matthewson may be recognizing that it just wasn't appropriate. His out was, I'm not a good actor, and this is not for me. And Meyers never did another vaudeville show, just that one year. So maybe he didn't realize. He may not even have known the script when he agreed to do it. But yeah, that is something that is troublesome, that he would agree to do that. But he came to accept being called chief. In fact, even he signed his autograph, chief, although he knew well. And when he came up in 1909, he asked reporters, "Please use my name. My name is John Tortes Meyers, or Jack, if you want to call me that. My name is not Chief. My first name is not Chief. Please don't call me Chief." And of course, he went right ahead and used it. And he finally just came to accept that this is the way it is.
Yeah, it also seems too that there's sort of maybe a bit of purposefulness, right, in this, right? So in some respects, right, we mentioned it before, right? Here is one of sort of the most, at the time, most prominent Native American players in sports. Obviously, we talked about Jim Thorpe, and that's another episode.
Along with the three most prominent are Bender, Meyers, and Thorpe. Thorpe never had that much success in baseball. Bender, one of the great pitchers for the Philadelphia Athletics, Connie Max, chosen for the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee.
Right, and our episode number 27 about Jim Thorpe and his days with the NFL, the Oorang Indians, with our friend Chris Willis.
Yes.
NFL
he was
Films.
a much better football player than baseball.
Right,
player.
but I also get the sense too, and especially now that you're referencing Meyers' later sort of rediscovery, I guess, in terms of television appearances and whatnot. It's almost maybe purposeful in that it is to use his fame and his
celebrity
quotage, right, to effectively work on shaping or evolving, I guess, the sort of preconceived notions of what a quote unquote Native American is and was.
Yeah, very definitely. I agree with that. There was a certain amount of purposefulness to it on his part. In his interview with Lawrence Ritter for Glory of Their Times, and some material I was able to find with Ritter talking about the interview process. He said he had a really tough time getting the interview started with Meyers, because Meyers was really wary that it was going to be another example of somebody trying to do a stereotypical take on Native Americans in baseball. Well, when he found that Ritter was genuinely interested in him as a person and his experience in baseball, he spoke freely. And one of the things he said was that Native American, and he's 80, he's in his 80s when he's interviewed by Ritter, that Native Americans have and still endure a great deal of prejudice. So he was certainly doing what he could to counter that. But in his interview with Ritter, he told Ritter, "I guess I'm like the venerable old warrior chief of the great Six Nations," that would be the Iroquois, "who announced his retirement by saying, 'I'm like an old hemlock. My head is still high, but the winds of close to 100 winters have whistled through my branches, and I have been witness to many wondrous things and many tragic things. My eyes perceive the present, but my roots are embedded deeply in the grandeur of the past.'" That was Meyers late in life.
Yeah. So what do you think the legacy then is? Because it's not like there was a huge rush of Native American players that came into baseball after
No,
him.
Unfortunately, this there was a lot of writing and among reporters speculating why Native Americans got into baseball, what they had to bring, and mostly it was the stereotypical notion that the phrase was the sons of the forest have brought their savage instincts to the ball field. But one of the myths that we're talking about later in Meyers' career, 1915 approximately, thereabouts, what's called the myth of the vanishing Indian gets popularized. I mean, there's a famous statue of an Indian warrior bowed over on his pony. It kind of symbolizes the moving into the past of the great Native American leaders and cultures of the past, and they're fading away, they're dying off. And in terms of baseball, there's a smattering of Native Americans in Major League Baseball. Some of the best, Allie Reynolds of the Yankees, in the 50s, he's called Super Chief. And as we move to the present, there are, in recent years, there are the three Native Americans in Major League Baseball have been Joba Chamberlain, who played for the Yankees mostly, Kyle Loesch, who played for a variety of teams, including the Cardinals, and last, the only Native American I'm aware of still in Major League Baseball is Jacoby Ellsbury, for the Yankees. So why is that? Well, they haven't played a lot of college ball, most Native Americans. They haven't been given the opportunity. Major League Baseball has had a program to try to foster inner city talent. No similar program on reservations or among Native American communities. Kind of shut out to some extent of baseball. Not given the recognition that they certainly do. Meyers' legacy. Well, let me just read something that someone wrote about Meyers early in his career, but it could just as well be an epitaph. A a strong love of justice, a lightning sense of humor, a fund of general information that runs from politics to Plato, a quick logical mind, and the self-contained, dignified poise that is the hallmark of good breeding. He is easily the most remarkable ball player in the big leagues. So that's the legacy, but unfortunately, most recently, when Meyers came up in popular writing, it was in Adam Gopnik's wrote a series of articles, essays in the New Yorker called the Rookie, and one of them is called The Rookie, and it's published in a collection called Moon Over Paris, I believe. Well, he portrays Meyers as someone who hangs out at Irish taverns and not the cultured person that he was. So the struggle goes on. I will say that Dartmouth is now one of the leading colleges in terms of Native American students, Native American programs. So that happened just as Meyers died in 1966, or 71, just as Meyers was in his last years. Dartmouth began to reclaim its proper role as a leader in Native American education. So that continues to this day. Dartmouth is probably at the forefront of Native American education. So he's had a mark. He leaves a mark, and for young Native Americans who are looking for role models in sports or just in general, I think he certainly stands out. And
why again is he not in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Was it because he had such a short amount of time in leagues?
Well, the quantitative answer is he only played 9 seasons.
Okay.
But my understanding is that's not a limitation for the Veterans Committee. If the Veterans Committee could, if it chose, give him consideration. And a few years ago, there was a discussion on the internet on one of the sites that rates people for the Hall of Fame, and it went back and forth. And the argument for putting him in the Hall of Fame is, as I said, his career batting average is Hall of Fame caliber. His intellect, his role in handling pitchers. We haven't gotten into one area where he was quite prominent. He was one of the early advocates of players' rights. Was chosen by his teammates when there was a need to go to management to present the player's case. He was looked upon as someone that they trusted to do that. Player's advocate, the fact that off the field he was one of the groundbreakers in terms of minorities' participation in baseball, not only participation but great success. So I think for those reasons, he should be given Hall of Fame consideration. But he's kind of faded. He's faded away. It's not likely. There's not really a contingent group of people making his case. I try to do it in the book, but so no, he's not going to get into the Hall of Fame, but he certainly deserves recognition as one of the best.
Well, it seems that if there was any opportunity for some groundswell for him, and frankly a bunch of other players, it probably would have been in the mid-'60s when Lawrence Ritter's book, The Glory of Their Times, came out, because it seems like that's when it renewed some spotlight, right?
Was chosen, and people say it's largely because of his being featured in Glory of the Times, maybe a couple of others. Names not coming to me that people say, yeah, it's because Lawrence Ritter gave them recognition that they made it in. But for whatever reason, Meyers has not been included in that group.
Well, let's remind our audience about your book and that book. Perhaps Amazon will probably recommend both of them at the same time, and I think I would too.
They'll both pop up, yeah.
Right. So Bill Young's book is called John Tortes, Chief Meyers, a Baseball Biography. It is published by our friends at McFarland. It is available wherever fine books are found. Of course, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just look for the episode of this episode, and you will see a couple of links to how to buy that book. And that other book that we did reference that came out in 1966, he says, It's called The Glory of Their Times, and that was written by Lawrence Ritter. And Chief Meyers is one of the dozens of baseball players that are interviewed in that, and I think it's probably a good yin and yang of understanding the more full, rich story of Meyers and his story, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think we'll put it out to our audience for those enmeshed in this conversation about maybe finding some of his Meyers' appearances on either the Today Show or the some of these other television shows. And unfortunately, as an aficionado of some of those old shows, not a lot of those things still exist. They were either taped over or discarded, and the value of such. But I wonder out there if we can find some footage of Meyers regaling some of his stories and his intellect, especially after his rediscovery in the 60s.
Well, just that CD, that set of CDs, which is available on the Glory of the Times, it gives a number of the stories from that book, a number of the people being interviewed, and just to hear Meyers' voice, that is a real treat.
Well, we will have a link to that book and CD as well on our site. So, Bill, tell us. This is the second time you've been here on the show, and obviously,
thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure, and obviously, like I said before, if you run a museum or a library, make sure you have extra security around, because Bill is probably knocking on the door trying to get in and maybe write another book. Do you have any other topics that you're thinking about or threatening to?
Well, my more recent book, the Meyers book, came out first, and then J.O. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs, which is about the first white owner of a team in the Negro Leagues.
Episode 14, if you want to go back in the archives of our show.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, great. I had a great time talking about that one. It's called Trailblazers in Black Baseball is the subtitle. But I've retained my interest in the Monarchs. So there were 14 players and Wilkinson, executive associated with the Monarchs, who were in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, Cooperstown, but by far the most of any of the Negro League teams. So I'm working now on maybe a project to tell the stories of those 14, a chapter on each of the Monarchs who are in the Hall of Fame. So that's what I'm working on now.
All right. Well, we look forward to staying in touch, hearing more about that, and indeed, hopefully we'll shine a few more spotlights on some other stories in the dead ball era, which is part of the rich tapestry that is baseball history in this country. I think you call it small ball today, but it's it's all about.
It's often called small ball.
Yeah, it's strategy, and it's not just about power and hitting and home runs and those kinds of things. It's really
manufacturing runs.
Yeah, it's where strategy comes into play, and arguably baseball is a very strategic game, always has been, and in many respects, those decades of the 1910s, 1920s were called the dead ball era, but essentially was kind of the real the heyday of how strategy became such an integral part of what is now the modern day game of baseball.
And John McGraw, you had the premier strategist.
And John McGraw in particular, the New York Giants, maybe generally, is obviously an area we'd love to spend a little bit more time on, and maybe
Definitely.
We will. So thank you very much, Bill. Always a pleasure, and thank you for coming back for a repeat
visit.
You're
doing a great job. I really appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you again.
I thank you so much for that interesting conversation. Bill Young, thank you for coming back to our show and talking about, I think, a very rich and interesting story on a number of different levels. I think the story of John Tortes, Chief Meyers, is interesting just as a biography. No doubt, some very interesting things that he did, the sort of erudite ways of probably unexpected, I guess, of a player of Native American origin, sort of a thinking man's approach to the baseball game, especially at that time when it was not necessarily a cerebral game. But as we sort of discussed, it's also a rich example, I guess, of some of the era of the dead ball era. We know in the 1910s and 1920s when strategy actually became a pretty important part of baseball, right? That players were actually starting to think through some of these issues. How do you manufacture runs when some of the equipment is just constantly reused and baseball is actually getting thrown back into the game of play, maybe because of cost, but the fact that the scuffs and all it's like we're going to continue to play with that, right? It was not sort of a lively concoction that baseballs physically are today. Home runs not as common as they are today, right? So the idea of playing what we call today small ball, right, became very strategic, right? How do you actually manufacture those runs and try to outwit the other team? And that's certainly where Meyers and his friends on the New York Giants, later the Brooklyn Robins and the Boston Braves, and the various players and teams in that era played. And John McGraw and the New York Giants, a very interesting topic that I think we'll go back to in episodes to come as more indication of how small ball and strategy really became an integral part of baseball. But frankly, let's be honest, right? And we talked about this quite a bit. The plight of the Native American, arguably the first sort of major minority to have to crack into and or assimilate into, if you will, the white man's game, right? That being of baseball. And interestingly, it harkens back to our episode number 14 with Bill Young, when we talked about some of these issues as it relates to African Americans and the whole Negro League saga. In some respects, this sort of the story of Meyers is almost a precursor on a maybe a smaller basis to the bigger and more pronounced plight of African Americans and their struggles to integrate into the game of baseball and writ large American sports too. So, these are issues that kind of go far beyond the issue that playing of games and being on teams and winning pennants. Right? These are social issues that unfortunately are still challenging us all as Americans and as human beings. And I think that's the interesting nature of this story. Being so multifaceted. The book that Bill wrote about Meyers is called John Tortes, Chief Meyers, a Baseball Biography. It is published by our friends at McFarland Press. You will find a link to this book, as you can always find links to books and CDs and videos and things that we reference on this show at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just go to the listen section. You'll see all the shows that we've done to date listed there. And of course, for every episode, you will see links conveniently there for you to consider a purchase of said media to go deeper into the stories that we talk about. The other book that we referenced, and frankly, when in 1966 or so, when it was published, is when Meyers actually sort of became rediscovered. We mentioned some of the television appearances that he made, and obviously we'd love to scour to find some of those, but there is audio of some of those appearances out there, I think, as part of this book as well. That book is called The Glory of Their Times. It's written by Lawrence Ritter. Like I said, it came out originally in 1966 by Macmillan, the publisher, but there have been a number of paperback editions that have come out since. We'll have a link to that book as well, and I highly encourage, if you're going to go deeper on this story, to read both of these books in tandem, both that of Bill Young's biography of Meyers, but also Meyers' contributions to the glory of their times, which again regales in some of the earliest days of baseball as these players were sort of nearing the natural end of their lives and reminiscing and recalling, and frankly, importantly, remembering this dead ball era, which was so crucial into the development of the sport that we know today. So a rich conversation, and thank you, Bill, for being part of our ongoing march towards what we like to rediscover about teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, and we thank you for being part of it. We also thank you for listening. We also encourage you to not only go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you'll find all the information that you need to know about us, all the old episodes, as we said, but also the social media links. If you want to send us an email, there's a link there. If you want to see us on social media, you will find the links there. But Twitter is at goodseatsstill. You can follow us on Facebook. Give us a like there. We love that. And if you want to go to Instagram and see a daily image from each week's show, you can do that too. And that's at Good Seats Still Available on the Instagram platform. We also want to thank, of course, our friends at Podfly Productions, who help deftly put this show together with all the elements that we try to throw their way and confuse and obfuscate. But the guys at Podfly are both professional, but they're also very good at what they do, and they keep me going, and I appreciate their help immensely. And they know who they are, but you should know them too. That's David Gregerson. That's Corey Coates. That's Jerry Payne, and that's Eric Begay, among a cast of others. Podfly Productions, give them a shout or a look at podfly.net, especially if you're considering your own podcast. Give them a try. Tell them that I and/or the Good Seats podcast sent you. And we now send you along your merry way. Thank you for listening to us. Please continue to do so and rate and review us if you like it. And we certainly love and are enthused by your enthusiasm, I guess, for the show. And we look forward to talking to you again next week. So until then, take care, everybody.